Ish, thank you so much for taking some time to talk to us today. It really is greatly, greatly appreciated. I'm going to be very mean, and I'm going to do that thing which interviewers often do. They ask a question which I think writers probably hate answering, or rather to remind you of when you won the Nobel Prize, and an interviewer asked you what you were working on at the moment. And you gave some sort of little pointers about the things that you were thinking about. You mentioned genetics, you mentioned artificial intelligence, and you mentioned robotics, and you were thinking about the impact that these things were going to have on the human population, particularly robotics. And now we have Clara and the Sun, which is clearly the book that you were working on. I wondered if you could talk about what it was about those themes, or what it was maybe in the world that you saw that made you want to tackle those ideas head on.
Well, it's not quite head on. You see, I'm not sure if I'm actually tackling the big themes about AI, gene editing, robotics head on at all. The direction Clara and the Sun came from was a completely different direction. It was the world of small children's books. And I literally had a little story for young children. There was an editor at Faber who kept encouraging me to write for children. And I thought, oh, I've got a little story here for very young children. And that story is more or less the kernel of Clara and the Sun. But I ran this little children's story, which I thought would work very well with pictures and illustrations and stuff. Past my daughter, who's she's not a child. She was then in her mid-20s. It's Naomi Ishiguro, who's a novelist herself. And she was then working in an independent bookstore, and she stared at me and said, "Look, there's no way you can go anywhere near young children with that story. That's going to just traumatize them." So I thought, oh right, but I thought it was a rather good story. So I thought I would use it in an adult book, and I had actually then quite separately and for its own sake, I've been interested in AI, gene editing. Those two areas had fascinated me, and I'd been attending conversations, with kind of experts, as the kind of the non-expert in the room, and conferences and things like this, where I was listening to a lot of that stuff, and I'd had conversations with actual kind of key leading people in that field, and I've been shown around their workplaces and things. So I had all that stuff going on anyway, and I thought, oh right, that could be the backdrop. But the novel wasn't essentially, it's not supposed to be my thoughts about, how AI, gene editing, all these things will impact on the world, but it's just kind of there in the background.
Really interesting about this idea of how you like to take genre and play with it, and to try and do something different with each book. This book, I suppose, would fit in, you could say it was sort of science fiction, speculative fiction, something like that. But I think I get the sense that you're not a great respecter of genre, or you don't even really like the idea of genre definitions. You're more trying to find new ways of exploring consistent themes in your work. Is that a fair assessment?
I think that is fair. I don't really see many boundaries between the genres. Maybe if you're a bookseller, that you are more conscious of these things, because you have to put things in shelves, but as a writer, I don't really see these boundaries very much, and I take what I need. And I've actually been rather passionate. I've been a kind of fan of different genres, and what the kind of worlds that they open up to me. So and actually, I mean, all right, I have to confess, I mean, it's also a kind of a ploy on my part, because actually I usually repeat myself quite a lot in my novels. Some novels are just kind of rewrites of the previous book, because I wanted to revisit that same terrain and explore it a little bit more, or slightly differently, or there was something not quite right about the last book and I wanted to do it again. But people don't really notice this very much, because I do it in a different genre or a different setting, and people think, oh, he's moved on, isn't he? He's quite brave. He keeps moving on. So it's a good disguise, because people are very literal minded. So, so yes, I mean, it might look like Clara and the Sun is a companion book to Never Let Me Go, and it is in many ways, And there is a relationship between those two books. But the genre that I was really conscious of what is the one I told you about, the one of the picture books for young children. That fascinated me, not just because of it gave me an idea for a kind of a narrator like that, a non-human narrator, which is very common in those kinds of books. You have teddy bears and soft toys and dolls, and animals as your protagonist. But but it's not just at that level. I find those books for children, the illustrations as much as the stories, quite poignant. You can see because you can see the wish on the part of the adults to shelter the children who'll be reading these books from what's coming up. So the world is presented as this kind of much kinder place. But at the same time, you can see a kind of tension there, because you can see that often the adults who've created that book don't want to lie to the children, and they feel a kind of need to drop little hints about particularly about sadness and death, or something dark that might be awaiting them, without really rubbing it in their faces. So you often see this in the drawings and in the stories themselves. So I wanted a lot of that to go into Clara and the Sun. I wanted that spirit. I wanted that kind of small child's logic. I even, visually, I wanted the thing to have the atmosphere of those kind of illustrations. The bright sun, the field, and these big sky, the colors. And Clara, to some extent, has the understanding and the vision of a young child who doesn't understand very much about the world, but is learning really fast. I mean, that's how she is at the beginning. Then she starts to change. She learns more.
I'm so pleased to hear you say that, because I was going to ask about Clara's worldview, I suppose, or how she sees the world, because despite the sophistication of her as an object, that she is this incredibly sophisticated robot, her view of the world is incredibly naive at the beginning. She observes, she's watching human behavior. She doesn't quite understand human motivation. And as you say, through the book, she begins to learn more and more about how humans work and operate and communicate to each other. And was that simply born out of the fact that it was initially a sort of an idea for a children's book, or did it also allow you, I suppose, to take the reader themselves on a journey of discovery along with Clara?
I think the latter very much. I mean, my children's story was, it's just a children's story. It ended very quickly. When I saw that option of having the protagonist as an AI person, that it just opened all these doors for me. If you have an outsider narrator like that, paradoxically, it does allow you to focus very sharply on specific aspects of the human world. And it feels very natural. So it feels quite natural for Clara, because she's created to prevent teenagers from being lonely, becoming lonely. I mean, that's a commercial purpose. That's why people like her are manufactured. She sees everything, certainly initially, through the lens of human loneliness. And she looks out of the shop window at the street going past, and she tries to decode it in terms of loneliness. Largely, she tries to spot loneliness, how people are trying to avoid loneliness. And when she goes to live with the family, and she realizes that there's kind of impending heartbreak and she in this family, and she wants to try and stop that. I mean, it becomes quite natural for her to ask questions like, so what does it mean to love? What do human beings mean when they say they love somebody? And if they lose that person is irreplaceable. I mean, what does that make sense? So having a narrator that is so outside, like her, I think is a way of actually really allowing us, both me and the readers, to can really focus in on some aspects of our lives, but from a fresh perspective.
You've said as well in the past that you're sort of wary of novels of ideas, and you've already sort of said that you weren't tackling some of these big ideas head on, and that, in fact, what you're more interested in is human emotion, and indeed the relationships between people. And in this book, we have lots of different types of relationship, but they're all tied together, as you say, by this idea of love and what people do. And in fact, in many cases, how far people will go in order to do something for somebody else. Is that the sort of, I suppose, the surprising observation for Clara as somebody watching from the outside?
Yes, I think she does. She does pick up a lot of these things that are what we might call, positive aspects of human beings. I mean, she doesn't. It takes her a while to get around this idea that some people will willingly make themselves lonely uh, because there are things that they care about more. Um, and so she sees that people are capable of human sacrifice, often for their children or for somebody that they love. And she takes on a lot of these qualities herself. I mean, she's an AI. She's learning from the human world, and so to some extent, she becomes a kind of a mirror, or albeit a kind of a distorted mirror of the human world that she understands. Um, but there's a part of her, as you said earlier on, there's a part of her at the same time as she's becoming very sophisticated that remains very childlike. And that aspect of her doesn't. There are various aspects of her that never seems to grow up, and one of them is that is her attitude to the sun. Because she's solar powered. When you first meet her, I mean, she thinks the sun is the source of all the nourishment for her and her fellow robots. Uh, and she believes it's not just solar powered beings like herself that benefits from the sun, but everybody, the whole world, human beings. The sun is always watching, always protectively, and you can turn to the sun when you really need help, and that's what she kind of believes. And it's a kind of like a child's logic, she can only see little bits of the world, and she jumps to conclusions from this kind of scant evidence, and that's one of the things that she comes to the conclusion about the sun. And so it's almost like a religious kind of thing, but I wanted her to always have this faith in the goodness of the sun that she would never lose.
And she retains a faith, I suppose, in human behavior, even whilst we, the reader, can sort of see perhaps a bit more about the motivations between some characters. And of course, reading what would seem to be about a very radically altered world to the one that we live in, of course, it isn't that far away from the world that we live in now. You've spoken in the past about how close we are with some of our recent technological advances to some of the things that might feel like science fiction, whether it's AI learning robots, the gene editing that means that we could soon have sort of two classes of person. Would you say that the hope that definitely exists in this book, particularly through Clara, is something that you share yourself about where we're heading, or do you have genuine concerns about this sort of these so-called advances?
Well, it's a mixture. I feel very excited about the breakthroughs that are happening in science at the moment. In a way, I think we are on the brink of a new era. Almost like when we entered the Industrial Revolution, maybe even more significant in terms of change and progress. But also, I think there are many dangers, and I think as a society, we have to kind of try and reorganize ourselves as best we can, so that the developments are beneficial and not damaging. And when we look back to the Industrial Revolution, I mean, human beings went through a terrible phase. Things like slavery came about to fuel the Industrial Revolution, and also children, 7-year-old children were sent down into the mines to work 10 hours a day and things like this. I mean, we don't want to do the equivalent again, but there are huge challenges. But I suppose in Clara and the Sun, Clara herself represents something optimistic about the future. But a lot of the backdrop is, if it's not downright dystopian, it's on the verge of turning dystopian. It's in flux. It's a society in flux. Hasn't quite figured out how to handle these changes, and it could go either way. That's the sense I wanted from that. I mean, you mentioned Never Let Me Go earlier on. I mean, when it must be 17 years ago, I was writing that book. It was published 16 years ago, so maybe longer ago. I started writing it almost 20 years ago. At that point, I was very conscious that I was delving into a kind of a fictional world or a fictional genre of science fiction to help me write that book. This time round, I never thought I was making reference to a genre, or sci-fi in this case, or I didn't really feel I was reaching for some sort of a bag of tropes or tools from a particular genre. I just went in there with the stuff that I had filled my head with, in my talking to the people about what's happening now. So I was never conscious of kind of building something a kind of like a prediction or something like this. And I think we haven't quite woken up as a community to how far we have come, because these things have happened very rapidly, in both of those fields, AI and gene editing. But I think that will change just even in the next year or 2 years. The Nobel Prize has just been awarded in the December that just gone by to the two pioneers of CRISPR, Jennifer Doudna and Emmanuel Charpentier. Nice to see a science Nobel Prize going to two women, which is, I think, it's never happened before. But CRISPR is basically this tool, a gene editing tool that opens up enormous medical advantages, amongst other things. Many of the illnesses that kill us and that we dread, we have defenses against them and treatments if the CRISPR treatments actually go forward. It's a complete groundbreaking thing, but at the same time, yes, it poses dangers as well. As you point out, it can create, once you can start altering people to be resistant to cancer, you can also make people intellectually superior or more athletic. And then we have what do you do in a meritocracy when you have a group of people who are objectively superior? Then meritocracies become savage things.
That sort of those advances, and CRISPR is a great example of sort of ways in which we could very quickly lose sight of what it is that makes us human, even whilst seeming to maintain that. And that is the central question, I suppose, at the heart of this book. And indeed, it seems to me with your body of work that you are constantly asking this question: what is it that makes us human? Now, I'm not going to ask you to boil down what you've discovered in your decades of writing to a pithy sentence, but why do you keep asking yourself that question? And does it feel more important now than ever?
Yes, it probably does. I mean, I feel more urgent than at other points in my career. I mean, the reason I was smiling slightly wryly when you said that, I'd always been concerned with this question: what does it mean to be human? It can come over slightly pretentiously if I say, do you know what my new novel's about? It's about what does it mean to be human? But actually, yes. I mean, guiltily, I have to say, yeah, that probably is the question that has been at the heart of a lot of things. But before, I suppose I was focusing on various aspects. How easy is it to waste your life? But behind all these kinds of questions, there is that question: why is it so important whether you waste your life or not? And the answer to that is because you're a human being. I mean, human beings have this concept of a good life and a not so good life, in a way that probably, cattle and dogs perhaps don't, and so that's what's always fascinated me. Maybe from, Never Let Me Go onwards, I've been much more consciously addressing that question more head on. And Clara and the Sun does ask that, because you introduce a non-human narrator to look at the world, and then you are asking that question very much head on. And I suppose it feels more urgent because we do live in a world where science and technology is challenging our kind of ancient ideas about what an individual is. This thing that we are bodies with kind of souls inside them, and it's by virtue of the soul that each of us is unique. And when I say that I love somebody, if I say that I love my wife or my daughter, in some way I'm making reference to this thing inside them, not the shell. Now that's something that I think we've had for centuries. and possibly some of that is a hangover from an age when we believed different things about the universe. But we still use that as a central assumption in how we relate to each other within families, within friendships. And I'm wondering if in this current climate, when we have algorithms and big data that claim to be able to more or less predict what your impulses will be in 3 days' time, what movie you might want to see, the implication behind that is that it might be possible to excavate completely this soul, you get it down in terms of information and data. And well, that's interesting or not, depending on your viewpoint. But I'm interested in whether that would change the way we look at each other, not just intellectually, but the way we feel towards each other. If we lose that sense of the uniqueness of the individual and the idea that this individual is irreplaceable, I'm wondering if we will actually start to behave differently towards each other. So this is a question at the heart of Clara and the Sun. When I say Clara wonders what human beings mean by love, I mean, I'm really saying that in a specific sense. She wonders why somebody loves one particular individual. What is it that's special about that individual that warrants this very powerful emotion?
I mentioned right at the beginning that interviewers have this annoying habit of asking writers what they're working on, but I do know that you have a period where you'll spend time thinking about an idea before you furiously sit down and write it. Are you already working on the next thing, or are you still focused very much on Clara and her story?
I'm really focused on this one, really. I mean, it's I have fewer ideas, I have to say, as I get older, but that's okay. I mean, I've never really worried about the quantity of books I produce, which is probably self-evident. I haven't been very prolific over the years, but every now and again, I can feel a whole world building in my head, and I get this sense that unless I put that into a book, it will never come into existence. And then there's a sense of urgency. I feel, oh, nobody else knows about this place. Nobody knows how it feels, the atmospheres, the smells, apart from me. So, and then I really do want to get it down. But that only happens to me once in a while. And it's the other thing I'll say, Will, is that something that the ideas that I audition as potential novels, they have quite a high bar, which is another excuse for why I haven't written many books in my life. It's very important to me that books linger in the mind long after the reader has finished reading them. Now, it always slightly puzzles me in this kind of creative writing world. You listen, when I go and talk to people in creative writing classes, or the rare occasions when I look at creative writing manuals and things, there's a lot of focus on how you hold the reader during the reading process. You hook the reader, keep them hanging on. Very little said, I have to say, about this business about longevity. It's almost like it doesn't matter once the reader has finished. But to me, it matters a lot, and it's always mattered a lot. And I spend a long time trying to figure out how to write books that will stay with people. And if I'm really lucky, or if I've been really successful, it might stay in the reader's mind for not just days, but weeks, months, even years, after the book has been finished. And that to me is a real ambition, because it seems to me that then you're actually really starting to change things. I'm talking a bit like a virus here. You have to lodge in insidious, and then you do kind of long whatever. I want long novel, but to me that's a very important part of my ambition. And there are a lot of ideas I look at, and I think, well, that might be entertaining while it's being read, but it's not going to have that haunting quality. It could be because I started off as a songwriter, and that is what you obviously try to do when you're writing a song. You know, I mean, you're not just entertaining people for the 3 minutes or something. Songs going on for, you want it to lodge in the minds of listeners, so that maybe even after they haven't heard the song for years, when they're in a particularly emotional condition or find themselves in a particular situation, that song comes back and it's a comfort to them, or it helps with some kind of perspective. You know, that's kind of what I'm looking for, and so it's quite difficult for me to find those kinds of ideas. There's something that I can build on that has that kind of power.
There'll be readers of yours watching this thinking, yes, I've been suffering from long Ishiguro for many years now, and long may it continue. Anyway, Ish, thank you so much for talking to us about Clara and the Sun. Really, really fascinating. Thank you for the book, and thank you for all the others too.
Well, thank you very much, Will, and really good to talk to you. Right, take care now.